She was left to die in the desert, but an Apache scout fed her from his own hand. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the distant mesas into ghostly mirages. Sarah. Mitchell's lips were already splitting from dehydration as she stumbled across the rocky terrain, her once pristine traveling dress now torn and dusty. The wagon train had left her behind 3 days ago. Or was it 4? Time blurred together in the endless expanse of sagebrush and stone. She had been traveling with the Henderson family from Missouri to California, paying her passage by helping with their children. But when scarlet fever struck little Emma Henderson, Sarah had stayed behind to nurse the child while the rest of the train pressed on, promising to send help back. They never did. Emma had died in her arms 2 nights ago, and the Hendersons had vanished into the desert, leaving Sarah with nothing but the clothes on her back and a nearly empty canteen. The Sonoran desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a labyrinth of thorny ocotillo and towering saguaro cacti that seemed to mock her predicament. Sarah had been walking southeast, following what she hoped was the old Butterfield overland route, but the trail markers were few and weathered beyond recognition. Her boots, designed for Missouri mud rather than desert rock, had worn through at the soles, and each step sent sharp pains shooting up her legs. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, Sarah's strength finally gave out. She collapsed beside a cluster of barrel cacti, their spines glinting like tiny daggers in the fading light. The irony wasn't lost on her. Surrounded by water-storing plants she couldn't access, dying of thirst in nature's own reservoir, she pulled out her father's pocket watch, a keepsake from her childhood in Boston. The hands pointed to 5:30, though whether morning or evening hardly mattered anymore. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her father's medical practice. The clean white walls of their Beacon Hill home, the sound of ships' horns drifting up from the harbor. She had left all of that behind after her father's death, seeking a new life in the West. Now it seemed she would find only death in this unforgiving landscape. The desert began its evening transformation as temperatures dropped and shadows lengthened. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry echoing off the canyon walls like a funeral dirge. Sarah shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had heard stories of what happened to people lost in the desert, the hallucinations, the slow surrender to madness, the way the body consumed itself in desperation. But as darkness crept across the desert floor, Sarah heard something else, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Her eyes flew open, hope and terror warring in her chest. Indians, perhaps, or maybe bandits. Either way, her fate was now out of her hands. A figure emerged from the twilight shadows, tall, lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to this harsh land. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out the details. Dark skin weathered by sun and wind, long black hair braided with leather strips, traditional Apache clothing adapted for desert travel. He carried a rifle across his back and a water gourd at his hip, moving with the careful, measured steps of a scout reading the land for signs. Their eyes met across the gathering darkness, and for a moment, neither moved. Sarah saw intelligence in his gaze, and something else, a careful assessment of her condition, her chances, her worth. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but only a raspy whisper emerged from her parched throat. The Apache scout studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the desert twilight. Then slowly, he approached. Nalnish had been tracking the wagon ruts for 2 days, following the deep grooves left by iron wheels across the desert floor. His job as a scout for the Territorial Army required him to monitor the movements of settlers, traders, and anyone else crossing through Apache lands. The military commanders at Fort Huachuca paid him well for information about potential threats or unusual activity along the southern routes. But this wasn't about military intelligence anymore. This was about the woman dying beside the barrel, cactus. He had seen the signs of the abandoned camp a half-mile back, hastily buried waste, scattered debris, the telltale marks of a family grave dug in rocky soil. Whoever these travelers were, they had lost someone and moved on quickly, probably driven by fear of disease or Apache raids. Such was the way of desert crossings. The strong survived. The weak were left behind. Nalnish crouched beside Sarah, close enough to smell the sickness and desperation on her. Her breathing was shallow, her skin flushed with fever despite the cooling air. In his 32 years, he had seen hundreds of white settlers pass through these lands, and most brought nothing but trouble for his people. The soldiers at the fort spoke of manifest destiny and civilization, but Nalnish saw only greed and carelessness in most of the faces that crossed his path. This woman was different, though. She wasn't trying to claim land or extract wealth from the desert. She was simply dying, abandoned by her own kind in a place that knew no mercy for the unprepared. He pulled the water gourd from his belt and studied its contents. 3 days of water remained, enough to get him back to the fort if he rationed carefully. Sharing it with a dying woman would put his own survival at risk, especially if he decided to help her reach safety. The smart choice, the survivalist choice, would be to mark her location and report it to the army. They might send a burial detail in a few weeks. But as Sarah's eyes fluttered open and fixed on his face, Nalnish saw something that changed his calculation. Not pleading or desperate bargaining, but a quiet acceptance of her fate combined with an unmistakable gratitude for human contact in her final moments. She wasn't demanding rescue. She was simply acknowledging his presence with the dignity of someone who had made peace with death. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. He'd say, one who shows kindness to a stranger may find the same kindness when he himself is lost. The old Apache way spoke of reciprocity, of the connections that bound all living things together in the harsh cycle of desert survival. Nalnish unstopped his water gourd and tilted it carefully towards Sarah's cracked lips. She drank slowly, instinctively, her body responding to the life-giving liquid even as her consciousness drifted. When she had taken what she could manage, he capped the gourd and sat back on his heels to think. The nearest settlement was Tucson, 3 days hard, travel to the northwest. Fort Huachuca lay 2 days south, but bringing a white woman there would raise uncomfortable questions about his loyalties and priorities. There was another option, though. His cousin's camp in the Dragoon Mountains, less than a day's journey, if they traveled carefully. But that choice carried its own risks. His people's relationship with white settlers remained tense despite the recent peace treaties. Bringing an outsider to their hidden camp could be seen as betrayal, or worse, as collaboration with those who sought to destroy the Apache way of life. As if sensing his internal struggle, Sarah stirred and managed to whisper a single word: "Please." The word hung in the desert air between them, carrying weight beyond its simple syllables. Not "please save me," not "please take me home," just "please." An acknowledgement of her complete dependence on his choice, his humanity, his willingness to see her as more than just another failed settler. Nalnish made his decision. He gathered dry brush and built a small fire as the desert temperature continued to drop. Sarah would need warmth to survive the night, and they would both need the psychological comfort of light in the vast darkness. Tomorrow, if she lived through the night, he would face the challenge of getting her to safety. He pulled strips of dried venison from his pack and softened them in precious water, then fed small pieces to Sarah by hand. Her body accepted the nourishment eagerly, and some color began to return to her cheeks. Between feedings, he spoke to her in English, his words carefully chosen and accented with the rhythms of his native tongue. "You will live through this night," he told her as stars began to appear in the clear desert sky. "Tomorrow we decide what comes next." Dawn broke across the Sonoran Desert with the slow burn of a blacksmith's forge, painting the eastern sky in shades of copper and gold. Sarah woke to find herself covered with a rough wool blanket, the remnants of a carefully tended fire still glowing beside her. The Apache scout, she still didn't know his name, was already moving about their makeshift camp, preparing for travel with the efficient motions of someone accustomed to quick departures. Her throat felt less like sandpaper this morning, and the world had stopped spinning quite so violently. The water and food he had shared with her during the night had pulled her back from the edge of delirium, though she remained desperately weak. When she tried to sit up, her muscles protested with sharp cramps. "Slowly," the scout said, appearing, at her side with the water gourd. Desert takes time to give back what it has stolen. His English was precise but carried the cadence of someone thinking in another language first. Sarah accepted the water gratefully, drinking in small sips as he had taught her. "What's your name?" she managed to ask. He hesitated before answering. "Nalnish, it means he works in my language." He gestured toward the east where the sun was climbing above the distant mountains. "We must move before the heat becomes too strong. Can you walk?" Sarah tested her, legs finding them shaky but functional. "I think so. Where are we going?" "There is a place in the mountains. My cousin's family camps there. They will have medicine, better food." He paused, studying her face. "But I must warn you, some of my people do not trust white settlers. You will need to show respect. Follow our ways while you are healing." The implications of his words weren't lost on Sarah. She was about to enter an Apache camp, something most white settlers would consider either impossible or fatal. But she was beyond caring about such concerns now. This man had saved her life, and she would trust his judgment about what came next. They broke camp efficiently, Nalnish erasing most traces of their presence with practiced sweeps of a juniper branch. He fashioned a walking stick for Sarah from a sturdy piece of manzanita, testing its height against her frame before handing it over. As they began walking northwest toward the purple bulk of the Dragoon Mountains, he set a pace that challenged her recovering strength without overwhelming it completely. The desert revealed new faces as they traveled, transforming from the harsh moonscape of Sarah's near-death experience into a complex ecosystem of adaptation and survival. Nalnish pointed out edible plants, the fruit of beryl cacti, the seeds of chia sage, the sweet pods of mesquite trees. He showed her how to read animal tracks in the sand, identifying the passage of javelinas, coyotes, and desert bighorn sheep. "This land is not empty," he explained as they rested in the shade of a towering saguaro. "White people see emptiness because they do not know how to look. We see home because our grandmothers taught us the language of stones and thorns." Sarah found herself fascinated by his perspective, so different from the conquest mentality she had encountered among her fellow travelers. "How long have your people lived here?" "Always," Nalnish replied simply. "Our stories say we emerged from this earth, that these mountains taught us how to live. Your people's stories say you came from across the great water, looking for something. You lost." He studied her face. "What did you lose, Sarah Mitchell?" The use of her name surprised her. She didn't remember telling him. "How do you—" "Your papers," he said, gesturing to her traveling bag, which he had somehow retrieved from her abandoned camp. "Also letters from your father." "He was a doctor?" Sarah nodded, feeling tears threaten for the first time since her ordeal began. "He died last winter. Pneumonia. I couldn't keep the practice going alone. Women can't be licensed physicians in Massachusetts. So I decided to start over in California, maybe work as a nurse or midwife." "Your father taught you healing?" "Some. Basic anatomy, common treatments, how to set bones and stitch wounds. He believed women had natural instincts for healing that formal training often suppressed." Nalnish absorbed this information silently as they resumed walking. The sun climbed higher, and the desert heat began building toward its daily crescendo. But the mountains were closer now, their slopes dotted with oak and pine that promised cooler temperatures and better shelter. "My cousin's wife is a medicine woman," Nalnish said eventually. "Perhaps she will want to speak with you about healing ways. White medicine and Apache medicine, sometimes they can learn from each other." The trail began climbing more steeply. As they entered the foothills winding between massive granite boulders and stands of juniper, Sarah's breathing became labored, but she pushed forward, determined not to slow their progress. The landscape was spectacular. Red rock formations jutting skyward like ancient cathedrals, hidden valleys carpeted with wildflowers, vista points that revealed the vast desert spreading endlessly to the south. As afternoon shadows began lengthening, Nalnish suddenly stopped and made a series of bird calls, complex trills and whistles that seemed to blend naturally with the desert soundscape. Moments later, an answering call echoed from somewhere ahead, and he relaxed visibly. "We are close now." he told Sarah. "Remember, show respect. Speak little until you understand the situation. My cousin's name is Goyawe. His wife is called Ishtan. They will decide whether you can stay." The camp revealed itself gradually as they climbed a narrow trail between towering rock formations. First, Sarah caught glimpses of smoke rising from hidden fires, then the earthy scent of cooking, food, and finally the sound of children's laughter echoing off canyon walls. When they rounded a final bend, she found herself looking down into a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone, where a dozen wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings made from bent saplings and brush, were scattered along a seasonal creek. The scene was both foreign and familiar to Sarah's eyes. Women were grinding corn on flat stones, their movements rhythmic and practiced. Children played games with sticks and stones while keeping watch over hobbled horses. Men worked on weapons and tools in the shade of oak trees, their conversation punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. It could have been any frontier settlement, except for the complete integration with the natural landscape and the alertness that marked every adult face. Their arrival was noticed immediately. Conversation stopped, and all eyes turned toward the ridge where Nalnish stood with his unexpected companion. Sarah felt the weight of their scrutiny, understanding that she represented everything uncertain and potentially dangerous about the changing world beyond their hidden valley. Goyawe emerged from the largest wickiup, a man in his 40s with the weathered features and easy authority of a respected leader. His conversation with Nalnish was rapid and intense, conducted in Apache with occasional gestures toward Sarah. She caught her own name several times, along with words that might have referred to water, death, and the desert crossing. While the men talked, an older woman approached Sarah with careful steps. This could only be Ishtan, the medicine woman Nalnish had mentioned. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in every detail of Sarah's condition and demeanor. Without speaking, she lifted Sarah's hands and examined the cuts and scrapes from her desert ordeal, then pressed her palm against Sarah's forehead to check for fever. "You are stronger than you look," Ishtan said in accented but clear English. "The desert did not break you, only tested you." She gestured toward a wickiup set slightly apart from the others. "You will rest there. I will bring medicine for your wounds and food for your strength." The dwelling was larger than it appeared from outside, its interior cool and surprisingly comfortable. Buffalo robes and woven mats covered the ground, while personal belongings hung from the framework in organized efficiency. Sarah sank gratefully onto a pile of soft hides, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of her ordeal finally catching up with her. Ishtan returned with a clay bowl containing a bitter tea made from desert willow bark and creosote bush, natural antibiotics, and pain relievers that Sarah recognized from her father's teachings about frontier medicine. Along with the tea came a meal of roasted venison, mesquite flour tortillas, and stewed tepary beans seasoned with wild oregano and chilies. "Your cousin risks much by bringing me here," Sarah said as Ishtan examined her feet, applying a soothing salve made from aloe and pine pitch to the worst abrasions. "Nalnish follows his grandmother's teachings," Ishtan replied. "She always said, 'The desert connects all living things. What helps one helps all.' But you are right to understand the danger. Some of our young men believe no white person can be trusted, that helping you makes us weak." As if summoned by their conversation, voices rose from the center of camp. Through the wickiup's entrance, Sarah could see a group of younger Apache, men gesturing emphatically as they spoke with Goyawe and Nalnish. Their tone suggested disagreement, possibly anger. "What are they saying?" Sarah asked. Ishtan listened for a moment before translating. "They remember the massacre at Camp Grant, the broken treaties, the children taken to government schools. They say every act of kindness toward white people is repaid with violence against Apache families." She met Sarah's eyes directly. "Can you prove them wrong?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the evening fires. Sarah understood that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the future relationship between this small band and the white settlers streaming through their territory. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I can't speak for other white people, can't promise what they might do. But I can tell you what I've learned traveling west. Most of us are just trying to survive, same as you. We're scared of things we don't understand, and fear makes people do terrible things." Ishton nodded slowly. "Fear, yes, but also greed. Your people want to own the land, to change it into something it was never meant to be. They see empty space where we see sacred places, enemies where we see relatives." Outside, the argument was growing more heated. Sarah caught fragments in English, words like spy and betrayal and soldiers. Her presence here was creating division within the band, exactly what Nalnish must have feared. "Maybe I should leave," Sarah said. "I don't want to cause trouble for people who've shown me kindness." "Running away is not the answer," Ishton replied firmly. "You are here now, part of our story whether you choose it or not. The question is, what kind of story it will be?" She gathered her medicine bundles and prepared to leave. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we will see what morning brings." As darkness settled over the camp, Sarah lay listening to the sounds of Apache life around her. Quiet conversations, children being called to evening meals, horses nickering in the makeshift corral. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, she felt safer than she had since leaving Missouri. These people understood survival in ways her own culture had forgotten, and their knowledge was keeping her alive. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its voice rising and falling like a desert lullaby. Sarah closed her eyes and let the sound carry her towards sleep, wondering what tomorrow would bring and whether she would live to see the resolution of the conflict her presence had created. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of horses approaching the camp. Through the Wickiup entrance, she could see riders silhouetted against the early morning sky, at least 6 men wearing the blue uniforms of the Territorial Army. Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. Someone had reported her presence to the military, and now the soldiers had come to retrieve her, potentially destroying the fragile peace of this hidden sanctuary. Nalnish appeared at her doorway, his face grim in the pale light. "Get dressed quickly," he said. "The captain wants to speak with you before they make their decision." "What decision?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew. "Whether to arrest me for harboring a missing settler, whether to report this camp's location to higher command, whether to trust that some things are better left alone." He helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed slightly. "Much depends on what you tell them about your time here." Outside, the camp had transformed into a tableau of tense confrontation. The Apache families stood in a loose semicircle, their faces carefully neutral, but their body language alert for trouble. The soldiers sat their horses with the casual authority of men accustomed to intimidating civilian populations, though Sarah noticed their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding ridges for potential threats. The officer in charge was a captain, in his 30s, dusty from hard riding and clearly uncomfortable with the situation. When he saw Sarah emerge from the Wickiup, his expression shifted from suspicion to relief. "Miss Mitchell, I presume. I'm Captain William Hayes, Fort Huachuca. We received word that you might be in this area." His tone was carefully professional, but Sarah detected genuine concern beneath the military formality. "Are you injured? Have you been harmed in any way?" "I'm alive because of these people," Sarah replied clearly, making sure her voice carried to both the soldiers and the Apache families. "They found me dying in the desert and shared their water, their food, their medicine. Without their help, you would have found only bones." Captain Hayes studied her face, searching for signs of coercion or fear. "Nevertheless, Miss Mitchell, there are protocols to follow. You'll need to come with us for medical evaluation and debriefing. There are also questions about your traveling companions. The Henderson family reported that you stayed behind voluntarily to care for a sick child." "That's correct. The child died of scarlet fever and they abandoned me rather than risk further contagion." Sarah felt her anger rising at the memory. "These Apache families showed me more Christian charity than my own people did." The comment hung in the morning air like gun smoke, creating visible discomfort among the soldiers. Captain Hayes cleared his throat and dismounted, approaching Sarah with measured steps. "Be that as it may, we have our orders. You'll need to come with us to Tucson, where arrangements can be made for your continued journey to California." Sarah looked around the camp, meeting the eyes of the people who had saved her life. Goyawe stood with arms crossed, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Ishton watched from beside her wickiup, holding the medicine bundle she had prepared for Sarah's journey. The younger Apache men who had argued for her removal now seemed vindicated by the soldiers' arrival, proof that no good deed toward white settlers went unpunished. But it was Nalnish whose expression captured Sarah's attention. He stood slightly apart from his family, bearing the weight of a decision that had put them all at risk. His eyes met hers across the small distance, and she saw resignation there, acceptance of whatever consequences his act of mercy might bring. "Captain Hayes," Sarah said, turning back to the officer, "I need you to understand something. This man," she gestured toward Nalnish, "saved my life at considerable personal risk. He could have left me to die, reported my location to your superiors, and collected whatever bounty the Army pays for such information. Instead, he shared his own water, carried me to safety, and convinced his family to shelter a stranger." The captain glanced at Nalnish, clearly uncomfortable with the implied criticism of standard military procedure. "Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your gratitude, but there are larger considerations here. The Army has worked hard to establish peaceful relations with cooperative Apache bands, but harboring missing settlers without proper notification creates complications." "What if I wasn't missing?" Sarah asked. "What if I had simply been visiting friends, learning about Apache healing methods, preparing to continue my journey with proper supplies and guidance?" Captain Hayes frowned. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would shape the future for everyone present. "I'm a trained medical assistant, Captain. My father was a physician, and I've been studying frontier medicine during my travels. The knowledge I've gained here about desert survival and natural healing could benefit many settlers crossing this territory." She gestured toward Ishton. "This woman knows more about treating desert ailments than most Army surgeons." The captain's expression shifted as he began to understand her proposition. "You're suggesting some form of cultural exchange?" "I'm suggesting that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than suspicion," Sarah replied. "These people aren't hiding from the Army. They're simply trying to live their lives in peace. If there were a formal understanding, a way for them to trade knowledge and supplies with settlers and soldiers, everyone would benefit." Goyawe stepped forward and spoke briefly to Nalnish in Apache, then addressed Captain Hayes directly. "We do not seek conflict with the Army or with peaceful settlers, but we will defend our families and our right to live as our ancestors taught us. If there can be mutual respect, mutual benefit, we are willing to talk." Captain Hayes looked around the camp, taking in the domestic scene, families going about their morning routines, children playing, elders working on traditional crafts. These weren't the savage raiders of military folklore, but people trying to preserve their way of life in a rapidly changing world. "I'll need to discuss this with my superiors," he said finally. "But I'm willing to recommend that this camp be recognized as a peaceful settlement, provided there's some formal arrangement for communication and trade." He turned back to Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, would you be willing to serve as an intermediary in such discussions?" Sarah looked at Nalnish, seeing hope beginning to replace resignation in his expression. She thought of her original plan to work as a nurse in California, and realized that her true calling might lie in bridging the gap between two cultures struggling to understand each other. "Yes, Captain. I believe I would." As the morning sun climbed higher over the Dragoon Mountains, casting golden light across the Red Rock Canyon, Sarah felt the first stirrings of a new life taking shape. She had come to the desert seeking escape from her past, but instead had found a future she never could have imagined. One that honored both her father's dedication to healing and her own growing understanding of what it meant to survive in an unforgiving but beautiful land. The Coyote Pack began their morning song from a distant ridge, their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of family, territory, and the endless cycle of desert life. Sarah listened to their chorus and smiled, knowing that her own voice would soon join the complex conversation of cultures learning to coexist in the vast American Southwest.